thank you all for joining me and the wonderful panelists that I've asked to join me as well. This is an event that I've actually been trying to put together since quarantine started, because even the issues of imperialism are always ever present, but it was evident around that time that there was a misunderstanding or not even an understanding of what imperialism actually is and how it affects us. And then in the beginning of Black August, I wasn't able to put this together because I was in the hospital with my son at the time. But Kamala Harris had gotten the vice presidency nomination, and there was a dire need for Black women, especially, to at least understand not just imperialism today, but the history of it and where Black women fit into it, and just the contradictions around a person like Kamala Harris and imperialism and Black women. So I am going to introduce the speakers, but they are also going to introduce themselves later on. I'm going to just talk a bit more in depth about why I wanted to do this and what this is going to be about, and sort of center the conversation. But yes, they are incredible. There's Anasatua. She is a back comrade of mine, but she has put in this work since I wasn't even in elementary school. And there's clips of her, speaking truth to power on C-SPAN, bringing up all of these things that we're talking about today as far as culture and media and Black representation and what these things actually stand for. Anye is my co-editor of Hood Communist, also a great comrade of mine. If you ever had the chance to check out any of her her AARP, excuse me, not AARP, AAPRP, New Mexico chapters, weekly videos. She is a powerful speaker. She does this. Organizing is natural for Anye, and you can tell that. I'm sure she's going to give us a taste of that. But you should check out their chapter weekly videos, and also her writing on Hood Communists. And then Nana is my heart, but Nana's also brilliant, brilliant organizer. I've done work with Nana in the past 2 years around abolition. Nana is a very powerful force into as far as speaking on what abolition is beyond these borders, and what it could mean beyond, just prisons, So that is just a little intro to them. They can fully tell you all about themselves when they introduce themselves before they get to speak. But I just wanted to sort of ground. This is why I asked these particular people to join me, because of how phenomenal they are. So while the title of the forum is rather self-explanatory, it's Black Women and Anti-Imperialism, but I just want to take a moment to discuss why I found it necessary to have this discussion as we draw closer to the elections and further away from understanding the structures and the functions that uphold this nation. In the context of Vote Blue no matter who, what is fixated on is domestic issues primarily, specifically in this climate of Black Lives Matter and racial justice. However, the failure to actually receive any kind of perceived racial justice has been purposely funneled into only addressing police violence against Black people in America is reliant on damaging internationalism and Pan-Africanism. So as many have noted, this has been made easier through the 8 years of Obama that gave off this perception of progress towards racial justice, while his administration was expanding the militarization and neocolonialization of the African continent and neoliberal groups of predominantly Black nations in the global South. And this also happened to coincide with the increase of police repression in the US during his 8 years of power. This disconnection has also been made more apparent through social media diaspora wars that have confused surface level and class issues for real material issues within the diaspora. It has also given life to reactionary groups like the American Descendants of Slaves, ADOS, which historically claims allegiances to a nation at the expense of Black immigrants, evoking a newfound Black patriotism, even further embedding Black people in America into the fabric of this colonial nation. All of these things possess a problem for the larger global struggle towards Black liberation. Furthermore, the failure to understand ourselves, Black in America, as a colonized nation of people within a nation further drives the wedge between understanding the necessity for internationalism. But what does this have to do with Black women, right? Well, in the 8 years of Obama, which coincided with the expansion of platforms awarded to Black women through social media vehicles like Twitter, more scholarship of Black women feminists were made available. However, while many of us spent years memorizing and reciting bell hooks, imperialist, capitalist, white supremacist, patriarchy phrase, far too many have yet to understand the material effect those terms have on our lives. And while many of us have come to understand intersectionality as coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, or triple oppression from Claudia Jones, or triple exploitation from Louise Thompson Patterson, or double jeopardy from Frances Beale, far too many of us have failed to understand the politics of these terms in relation to anti-Black, pan-European hegemony, and why it's important to understand those directly affected are always women and children, and why we need to organize against it. So, I'm going to stop sharing for a bit. I want to share a video, so give me a moment to pull that up. At the beginning of the pandemic, At the beginning of the pandemic, I was one of many Black women that had the opportunity to check out the founders of Girl Trek. They interviewed Angela Davis and Nikki Giovanni. So I'm going to play a portion of that interview now, and I just want us to sit with what Angela Davis says in response to the question of calling oneself a feminist. So just give me a second. All right, I'm going to share my screen. Sorry, listen, work with me, guys, because I'm not technical. I literally
one final question, and I was talking to your team in your office, and they were like, please, 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 make sure to support and bring up kind of the notion of feminism, and let's talk about it. And I feel comfortable.
Erica, when you mute yourself, it mutes the video. So you got to unmute yourself.
Revolutionary seems more apt when people are trying to kill us. And I know the history of feminism, and it wasn't designed for Black women. And I wonder, as someone who is an absolute just admirer and student of yours, I want to know why Black women should call themselves feminist.
Well, I don't know whether it's so much a question of what we should call ourselves. But I can tell you that some years ago, my response was exactly the same. I'm not a feminist. I'm a revolutionary. I'm a revolutionary Black woman. Why should I identify with feminism? But I was thinking about the feminism that had been produced by middle-class bourgeois white women. And I failed to recognize that Black women, women of color, poor women have developed a long tradition of feminism, which is increasingly becoming the feminism that we all recognize. The fact that the term intersectionality is one of the most popular terms associated with feminism reflects the fact that there have been those of us who argue that feminism is not simply about gender, and certainly not simply about women, and certainly not simply about white women. But it is about understanding the connections between race and gender and sexuality and imperialism and capitalism. So the kind of feminism that I associate with is anti-racist feminism. It is anti-capitalist feminism. It's the kind of feminism that Black women have always embraced and always helped to produce and reproduce.
She's something else, ain't she? But so now I'm going to get into some definitions to help center the direction of this forum. And I'm going to offer some clarity on the discussion at large. Feminism, the advocacy of women's rights on the basis of equality of sexes. Black feminism. Black feminism holds that experience of Black women gives rise to a particular understanding of their position in relation to sexism, class, oppression, and racism. Womanism, from womanish, opposite of girlish, i.e., frivolous, irresponsible, not serious. A Black feminist or feminist of color. From the Black folk expression of mothers to female children, you acting womanish, i.e., like a woman, usually referring to outrageous, audacious, courageous, or willful behavior, wanting to know more and in greater depth than is considered good for one. Interested in grown-up doings, acting grown-up, being grown-up, interchangeable with other Black folk expressions. You trying to be grown, responsible, in charge, serious. Also, a woman who loves other women, sexually and or non-sexually, appreciates and prefers women's culture, women's emotional flexibility, values tears as natural counterbalance of laughter, and women's strength, sometimes loves individual men, sexually and or non-sexually, committed to survival and wholeness of the entire people, male and female, not a separatist, except periodically for health. Traditionally a universalist, as in, Mama, why are we black, brown, pink, and yellow, and our cousins are white, beige, and black? Answer, well, you know the colored race is just like a flower garden, and every color flower represented. Traditionally capable, as in, Mama, I'm walking to Canada, and I'm taking you and a bunch of other slaves with me. Reply, it wouldn't be the first time. Loves music, loves dance, loves the moon, loves the spirit, loves love and food and roundness, loves struggle, loves the folk, loves herself, regardless. Womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender. Intersectionality is the interconnected nature of social characterizations such as race, class, and gender as they apply to a given individual or group, regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. Internationalism. It refers to the idea of cooperation between different countries is beneficial for everyone, transcends nationalism, and advocates a greater political or economic cooperation among nations and people. Imperialism is a higher stage in the development of capitalism, where a nation or conglomerate of nations, like the European Union, dominates other nations either by territorial acquisition, colonies, or the establishment of economic and political hegemony over them. The imperialist nation seeks to plunder the oppressed nation for profit and often supports dictatorial leadership in order to ensure a continual flow of raw materials, essential resources, and cheap exports. So now I'm going to talk about the historical legacies of Black women, internationalism, and anti-imperialist politics. And I wanted to just do a brief showing of a few women, primarily the more popular women that we have discussed and often and have attributed to the expansion and the growth in our womanhood and understanding our own womanhood as Black women. So Claudia Jones, her name is more recognizable as of late because of her passage in her essay, The Neglect of the Problem with the Negro Woman. But what often happens, that happens with a lot of so-called Black radicals, is sort of a diminishing or an erasure of their either communist ties or communist politics. And so I'm gonna read the bio. So Claudia Jones is she was an African Trinidadian feminist Marxist who fought for the liberation of women, Africans, and members of the African diaspora, as well as eradication of colonialism, imperialism throughout the world, which remained central to her organizing. So in The Neglect of the Problem of the Negro Woman, she explains that for the progressive women's movement, the Negro woman, who combines in her status the worker, the Negro, and the woman, is the vital link to this heightened political consciousness, to the extent, further, that the cause of the Negro woman worker is promoted. She will be enabled to take her rightful place in the Negro proletarian leadership of the national liberation movement, and by her active participation contribute to the entire American working class, whose historic mission is the achievement of a socialist America, the final and full guarantee of women's emancipation. And in the book, Left for Karl Marx, it explains that Claudia's anti-imperialist politics linked the local struggles of Black people and women against racism and sexist oppression to the international struggles against colonialism and imperialism. The Combahee River Collective, again, a lot of the politics around this collective, even as we all know certain members now as individuals, but the politics of the collective have been stripped away. So we often hear, the phrase, I want to paraphrase, it's often paraphrased their words around, we're not free until we're all free, and that sort of idea as far as Black women are centered, but their politics was rooted in socialism, which I want to read a little bit from the Combahee River and Collective Statement so you get a full grasp of why it was rooted in socialism and why they felt that that was a pathway towards a liberation for Black women. And so the Combahee River Collective was a Black feminist lesbian organization that was active in Boston from 1974 to 1980. And in their statement, they state, We realize that the liberation of all oppressed peoples necessitates the destruction of the political economic systems of capitalism and imperialism, as well as patriarchy. We are socialists because we believe that the work must be organized for the collective benefit of those who do the work and create the products, and not for the benefit of the bosses. Material resources must be equally distributed among those who create these resources. We are not convinced, however, that a socialist revolution that is not also a feminist and anti-racist revolution will guarantee our liberation. We have arrived at the necessity for developing an understanding of class relationships that takes into account the specific class position of Black women who are generally marginal in the labor force. While at this particular time, some of us are temporarily viewed as doubly desirable tokens at the white collar and professional levels. We need to articulate the real class situation of persons who are not merely raceless, sexless workers, but for whom racial and sexual oppression are significant determinants in their working economic lives. Although we are in essential agreement with Marx's theory as it applied to the very specific economic relationships he analyzed, we know that his analysis must be extended further in order for us to understand our specific economic situation as Black women. So again, this doesn't differ much from what Claudia Jones was explaining. And again, Claudia Jones was a Marxist-Leninist, and she expanded Marxism in the same ways to help us further understand our material reality and our specific economic situation as Black women. And in doing so, both saw the necessity for anti-imperialism. So Audre Lorde, right? So Audre Lorde is, we know her we're familiar with self-care, although the politics of even that has been stripped, even though the politics of that has been stripped away from the actual reason it was the term was coined around the sort of medical neglect of Black women and the necessity for us to take care of ourselves and for the betterment of our community. And she further understood this again through socialist understanding of how those things could be applied to our overall liberation. So she was an African Grenadian American writer, feminist, womanist, radical. And in her essay, Apartheid USA, she states that the connections between Africans and African Americans, African Europeans, African Asians is real, however dimly seen at times. And we all need to examine without sentimentality or stereotype what the injection of Africanness into the socio-political consciousness of the world could mean. We need to join our differences and articulate our particular strengths in the service of our mutual survivals and against the desperate backlash which attempts to keep the Africanists from altering the very basis of current world power and privilege. June Jordan, incredible, prolific writer. I can't say enough about June Jordan, but I do know that how I feel about June Jordan, so many of the Black women that I keep in my circle, we have the same understanding of how her writing has touched us. But little is known about the extent of her writing. I think we really fixate on a lot of her writing around Black womanhood and her coming up into her Black womanhood, but her work around Black English, which we now refer to as AAVE, and the need to sustain that for Black children, and even her work, again, on anti-imperialism, which was an essay that she wrote in Essence, I believe, either Essence or Ebony. Don't quote me on that one, but the essay itself is called Nicaragua and Why I Had to Go There. And she pretty much details her trip in Nicaragua and having seen firsthand the long arm of US imperialism. So I want to read a quote from that essay. a little passage, excuse me. Like a lot of Black women, I have always had to invent the power my freedom requires. And all my life, I've been studying the revolution. I've been looking for it, pushing at the possibilities, and waiting for that moment when there's no more room for rhetoric, for research, or for reason. When there's only my life or my death left to act upon. Here in the United States, you do get weary. After a while, you could spend your best energies forever writing letters to the New York Times. But you know in your gut that writing back is not the same as fighting back. Bell Hooks. So I stated, I mentioned her earlier in the introduction about how we have all come to, you know, overuse that phrase probably, imperialist, capitalist, white supremacist, patriarchy. You know, people have added and taken away from the phrase how it suits them. Um, but again, I think that in saying that, we've discussed the intersectionalities of these issues without ever really addressing the root of these issues, right? Because all of that could just be summed up as colonialism, right? Imperialists, white supremacists, you know, capitalist patriarchy is colonialism essentially. But the breakdown of it is important, because we need to understand what those terms are and how they function. And bell hooks, I think with even just putting those phrases together and putting those terms together into, you know, creating a framework and understanding where Black women fit into that is very essential. But again, that is still sort of taken away and watered down, or even thrown in a pot with intersectionality or academia, where it's sort of dismissed and not really looked into. And I wanted to take a moment to just talk about this particular quote, because it's very important when we stretch out those terms and we boil it down to colonialism. I think that right here is where we really get the understanding of what that all means. So Bell Hooks is a Black American author, professor, feminist, and social activist. Um, so she says, patriarchy both creates the rage in boys and then contains it for later use, making it a resource to exploit later on as boys become men. As a national product, this rage can be garnered to further imperialism, hatred, and oppression of women and men globally. This rage is needed if boys are to become men willing to travel around the world to fight wars without ever demanding that there are other ways of solving conflict can be found. And of course, Asada Shakur, we have nothing to lose but our chains. Um, you know, Asada taught me where you sometimes have to ask, did she really? Um, because you're not really sure exactly what people grasp from that autobiography or pull quotes, but it's important to really, really understand her politics. So if you're going to learn about Assata Shakur, please learn about Assata Shakur, and then learn about the Black Liberation Army and our Black political prisoners who were a part of seeing her get to Cuba, who are still incarcerated, who need to come home. You know, learn about Marilyn Buck, because that is a comrade, white people. So yeah. Assata Shakur is a former member of the Black Liberation Army and a current political refugee in Cuba. And she says, people are really beginning to see the mechanism of imperialism. When colonialism existed, people could see colonialism. When racial segregation existed in its apartheid form, people could really see the whites only signs. But it's much more difficult to see the structures of neo-imperialism, neo-colonialism, and neo-slavery. And that's where we're finding ourselves in this moment. So, why should Black women in the US care about imperialism? So, that is where we are finding ourselves now. And I want to introduce these panel speakers. Nana Muchi and Asantua Nkrumah Torre and Anasawa Sanu Shatoya. As I introduced these speakers earlier, they are just profound and incredible speakers. But more than that, they are very, 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 very clear in their understanding of this work and why it's very important to organize around it. So, Nana, I'm going to let you introduce yourself and also our wonderful ASL interpreters that I'm so thankful were able to join us this evening.
Yes, I'm like pulling up my notes because I'm pretty nervous. Okay. Hey y'all. My name is Nena. I use they, them pronouns or any pronouns. I've been organizing for a while. I think most of my organizing was like on campus with student organizing in like BSUs and African Black Coalition in California, and then also just little points of activism growing up in predominantly Asian suburb in Southern California outside of LA. And so, yeah, I for the last 4 years, I was organizing with an organization, Black Youth Project 100, and that's really my first political home that I spent a lot of time growing, being challenged, and like developing myself and the organizer that I am today, and also where I came to understand my Black queer feminist politic and also my abolitionist politic. And I'm excited to be here because Erica has introduced me to a lot and exposed me to a lot and agitated and challenged me a lot in my anti-imperialist Black communist politic. And so, yeah, should I start talking or are we all introducing ourselves?
You can start. Everyone can introduce themselves as they begin.
Cool. So I'm talking a little bit about state repression in colonized communities and state repression against protesters, right? There's like a lot of conversation around fascism, right? Even though folks been calling fascism for, decades. And it's like, you'll read something in 1960 and they're like, oh, the liberals who may think that fascism is not here have not been paying attention to the conditions that Black people have lived in this country and globally. And as Erica pointed out, we can kind of conceptualize everything under colonialism or capitalism or imperialism. And capitalists, as we've seen in this during COVID-19, have gotten richer, right? There's more millionaires, there's more billionaires. The top class of capitalists have gotten richer during this time. And in order for capitalists to maintain their wealth, they have to use repression. And that is since the inception of this country. The US is one of, if not the most repressive regime in the world. And the US deploys its military, its police, and its prisons for social control, which, really abolition, again, is one of many frameworks. It's a helpful framework in understanding how the prison industrial complex operates, which is really the state's tool of controlling Black people, controlling disabled people, controlling anybody who fits outside of this like white hetero normativity understanding of human. And whoever who the capitalists do not value based on your body or your disability or what you can produce for the capitalists to make profit. And yeah, the underdevelopment and the underfunding of Black communities is to further state repression, domination, and control. And the fact that people in the US, including myself, can go days, months, and years without knowing what's happening outside of this country, let alone what is happening inside of our state, is a form of repression. We live in the police state, and the police's role is to, like I said, repress colonized communities. And it keeps us from convening with each other. It keeps us from engaging in survival economies, prevents folks from creating and sustaining relationships and community among each other, right? We see this through gentrification, and even folks who may be Black transplants, right? You may be moving every year, and part of that is to disrupt any type of organizing across class also. And to continuously position folks who may be Black class people outside of like class struggle with working class, poor Black people. And yeah, this is, like I said, this has been since slavery, and we see this in the way that laws have constructed to criminalize every aspect of our lives. I mean, I don't know, how many slave revolts do folks think happen in this country? It's a random question.
Many.
I mean, I don't think we know, right? Like the fact that, you know, it has been such a level, you know, we're just discovering the level of revolts, the level of uprisings, and that with each generation, there's an archiving of information is a form of repression, right? Yeah, I don't know what I'm saying. So another thing, Black codes were instituted in 1865 after the Civil War and during Reconstruction era to restrict Black people's freedom and basically relegate them to continue the status of a slave by forcing them to work at really low wages, or if they were getting paid at all, through, again, policing and economic warfare. And prior to that, there were slave codes. So like, again, I'm talking about this class, even like the class conditions of like Black people, where like Black codes were also targeted at free Black people in order for free Black people not to organize with non-free Black people. And then, you know, I'm also a lawyer, so I know that there are thousands of laws on books restricting and controlling Black people's livelihoods. And one of the things that we've been fighting for in DC for a few years is the decriminalization of sex work, which has historically and currently used to control Black women's bodies, gender, and sexualities, and other marginalized groups. And we can look at this like post-Civil War, again, during this era, where prostitution laws were used to stop communists, right? Like anti-communism was directly tied to anti-prostitution laws, was directly tied to prohibition laws. And oftentimes, you know, Black women may be wandering, quote unquote, in Harlem, and because they're unmarried or because they don't have a documentation, like Erica talked about how patriarchy is directly connected to imperialism, that was a form of like controlling folks across class lines and across race lines and across like sexuality. Yeah, and then to go into, I think this conversation also illuminates like the debate around the concept of political prisoner, right? Where like some folks would say that everybody who's incarcerated is a political prisoner because it's a form of like state repression, but we can have that debate. But I wanted to go to like, now I'm going to talk about state repression of protesters. And I pulled this, sorry, I'm like in the comments, okay. I pulled this from Popular Resistance, which said, by late June, protests had emerged in at least 1,700 cities and towns, large and small, across all 50 states. In response to this widespread unrest on June 1st, 62,000 National Guard troops mobilized in at least 25 states, working in cooperation with police to dominate the streets. And this was in a lot of big cities, and particularly Democratic governed and led cities, including DC, where our mayor is a Black woman, and she's also a Democrat who is anti-Trump. But you know, I just posted like 2 years ago, white supremacists were coming to town, and she spent like millions of over $1 million on policing in order to support the white supremacists' right to protest. And so, yeah, we see that that state repression also works through protests. And 2 days ago in DC, the DC Park Police, because DC has the most police per capita in the country, And we have a lot of different federal and local agencies who all work in collaboration. So even when Mayor Muriel Bowser says, oh, that's the feds, it's like the feds, we know that the feds and local agencies work hand in hand. But 2 days ago, the DC Park Police went to one of my comrades' house, the They Them Collective, who has been organizing weekly protests called Free the People, Free the Land, and Fuck the Police, where they've been protesting at strategic spots and have also created mutual aid networks where they feed houseless folks weekly and are running a community food distribution to trans and queer people of color. The park police showed up without a warrant, not that they need one, claiming that they were looking for someone who had lived there over a year ago. They went through the front of the house, the back of the house. They Them Collective put out a call and many people showed up and drove the police out. And one of those people was one of my comrades, April, with Black Lives Matter DC. And when she got home from the They Them Collective, a police car was sitting outside of her house. And mind you, this is an everyday occurrence. They track her consistently. They pop up at her house at protests or when she's in the streets, they say her name, her full name, you know, as a form of psychological warfare. And so while she's not incarcerated, she's also still facing deep state repression, like has done FOIA requests with thousands and thousands of documents by the DC government and DC police. And so, go ahead. Was someone saying something? But yeah, so just uplifting that, like, this is it's a daily occurrence for Black people. So there's political repression, but there's also the many ways that the state represses us through the law and through the police and through the prisons. Another way the state represses movements is through co-optation. And we see this with movements that may have started out having radical potential, but are being co-opted with the state to align with the democratic establishment under the guise of building power. And it's like, if we're doing something right, the state is not going to stand for it unless they have found a way to co-opt it and control it through institutions, through money, through power. And so we have to be really wary of what may be tactical decisions that don't have some type of external mass movement. We see this with corporations branding Black Lives Matter and other forms. And, you know, some people argue that the phrase Black Lives Matter was not radical to begin with. And, you know, we can debate that. But I think that my comrade Bill Fina always mentions like Huey Newton's intercommunalism essay that says things are radical within the context. So maybe it's not radical today, but at that point it was radical. And so the state has co-opted it and has quelled that type of, you know, resistance. And we, you know, one last thing as I close out, another way that state repression happens through co-optation or like demonizing the enemy. We saw this during like Obama running for president. They called him a socialist, even though he was right-wing in the Democratic Party. I know I'm running outside. When Bernie was running for president, they kept saying socialist. And even during the Obama years, they kept saying Antifa, right, to demonize anti-fascists, right? People are like on one end saying that they're against fascism, but then on another end demonizing anti-fascists. So it's like, are you anti-fascist or are you fascist? You know, like, what do you believe? And we also saw this with the Black Lives Matter movement, the creation of the Black identity extremists, right? To again, demonize any type of political organizing or potential for political organizing against the state. And that is what state repression does. It tries to stop the overthrow of the government. And I mean, I think as communists, that is like what we're essentially trying to do. And so, of course, they're going to demonize that. And it's very few positive things that we've heard about communism in the mass media. But now the new thing is Antifa, anarchists, and communists. And so that is one way of state repression. Okay, I'm done.
Thank you so much, Nana. Next we have Anasatua. So Anasatua, if you want to introduce yourself. And you're on mute.
All right. Everyone hear me? Okay, very good. Good evening and warm sisterly affection to everyone. My name is Asantwa Nkrumah Ture. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I'm an active dues-paying member of Black Alliance for Peace, the Green Party of Philadelphia, and the Philadelphia Tenants Union. I'm also an active member of the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign, Poor People's Army, all here in Philadelphia. So first, let me thank Erica for this invitation to this discussion. Really appreciate it, Erica. Also, let me say thank you to Nana Amuchi and Ose Sanwu Chitoye of the AAPRP. Thank you all for also participating in this discussion, and thank you both for the work you do in your respective organizations. I was very pleased to see I was being invited to this discussion because many years ago, some of you may know, I was also a member of the All African People's Revolutionary Party. I was also former union coordinator of the AAPRP's Women's Union. My membership was from 1981 to 1997. Yeah, I know I just told my age, but you know, black don't crack, right? Black don't crack. But anyway, it brought fond memories for when I first interviewed our big brother, Kwame Ture, when I was a student at Langston University, Langston, Oklahoma in 1977, 100 years ago. But anywho, I really appreciate this topic. It's very timely. It's one that we've discussed off and on for many, many years, but it's still relevant, particularly in times like this, particularly in this stage of US capitalism and US imperialism. And we need to really be sure of what we believe in, how we approach our political work, how we stay motivated to stay active in organizations. This is always important. There's a long, long history of African women being involved in anti-imperialist struggles of one kind or another. And for me, it serves as a means to inspire me, to help me to stay motivated, to help me stay focused, and you know, to really focus on my tasks ahead of me and focus on the work that I'm doing and the work I'm doing with other people. Okay, so also for me, for our sisters, for African women to be anti-imperialists, while we're at the same time affirming ourselves as Pan-Africanists, as organizers, and all the other various roles that we carry out, it simply means that we see ourselves as one people, and we want the best for our people. We want to work for the betterment of our people, and we have to be active in organizations to do that. That also means that we recognize not only imperialism and how that's our common enemy, but we have to also take a political stand against what I call all the other anti-people isms, you know, against capitalism, against sexism and patriarchy, against homophobia, transphobia, heterosexism, Zionism, all the anti-people isms, because we know that these things do harm to us. We see the harm in our communities, to our people, to our families. We see how these isms cause great harm to other people of the world. And many of us come to a point where we say, hey, you know, we know this is wrong. We know this needs to stop. What is my responsibility to help in these wrong things? So I think that's very, very important. What I want to do is highlight some of the, it's way too many sisters to really talk about in a discussion like this, but I want to highlight some kind of quickly. And Erica, if you can help me with my PowerPoint there. Are you able to do that? Erica, can you hear me?
Yeah, I got you. Hold on, give me a second.
Oh, okay, sorry.
No, I was talking and I was
Well, once you put up a slide, I was gonna talk a little bit about that slide.
I'm pulling it up.
Okay. Yeah, and big thanks to our ASL interpreters too. Thank you so much.
Okay. Now I'm going to share. I'm learning.
Okay, there we go. Okay, so Black women and anti-imperialism. All right. So we got that. Let's go to the next one. My slide there, that's who I call Mama Anna Julia Cooper. She was a public speaker, a teacher, activist, scholar. She wrote a great piece, A Voice from the South by a Black Woman of the South, published in 1892. And that was considered the first or one of the first modern Black feminist writings going into the 20th century. She also attended the first Pan-Africanist conference in London, England in 1900. So she was doing a lot of things when she was well ahead of her time. So the next one. Now I'm kind of partial to Ya Santua, and you all could probably imagine why. Ha 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 ha, where I get my name from. So that's Ya Asantua of the Ashanti people of Ghana. So also in 1900, she stirred her people to fight back against the British, sought to regain the golden stool. The golden stool was a stool that held a lot of importance to the Ashanti people. And she rallied the people to say, hey, we gotta fight for our pride, fight for our dignity. We must regain the golden stool. Okay, and the next one. Now, this group of sisters here, I didn't know about until I was preparing for this discussion. Well, I knew about these women, but I didn't know they formed this type of organization, Sojourners for Truth and Justice, a national mobilization of Black women against racism and unjust U.S. domestic and foreign policy. So that was Louise Thompson Patterson, Shirley Graham Du Bois, and Charlotta Bass. Now we see here Shirley Graham Du Bois is in Ghana with Malcolm X, and Mama Shirley helped to set up the itinerary from when Malcolm was in Ghana and meeting with Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana. Charlotta Bass is now enjoying some renewed interest because she was the first Black woman in the United States to run for vice president on a political party ticket. She was running on the Progressive Party ticket. And what's interesting about Charlotta Bass, the head of her ticket was Vincent Hanneman. Vincent Hanneman. He was running for president. She was running for vice president on the Progressive Party ticket. Vincent Hanneman's son, I can't remember his name, but his son ran against Kamala Harris in 2003, 2004 and lost, even though he was a much more progressive candidate on a lot of different issues. But Kamala Harris at that time pretty much enjoyed a lot of financial support from the money class in that election, running for district attorney. So I think it's kind of funny, all those many years later, how those paths crossed. Okay, go to the next one. Now this is my other mother here, Claudia Jones. Erica talked about her a little while ago. I won't go over all of her accomplishments, but it is interesting to note that she helped to organize the first Free Nelson Mandela campaign outside of Africa. She founded in 1958 and edited an anti-racist, anti-imperialist newspaper called the West Indian Gazette. She was also responsible for starting Carnival in London, which then spread to other places in Europe and other parts of North America. So she was definitely ahead of her time. And what I appreciate about Claudia Jones is that in spite of the racism and sexism she faced in the Communist Party in the United States and then Great Britain when she was deported, she never abandoned her communist principles. So next one. Okay. Okay, I see Nikita Joseph. Okay, got you, sis, got you. So this is Fatima Barnawi. She was born in Jerusalem. She was a full-fledged member of the Palestine Liberation Organization, and she is known as the first Palestinian woman to have organized a paramilitary operation inside of Israel, which was the attempted bombing of a movie theater in October 1967. Imagine that. And she is still held in very high regard by Palestinians. So the picture on the left is her today. She's in her 80s. And the other picture on the right was her back in the day. Okay. You okay, Erica? Okay, we talked about Fatima Barnawi. Okay. Want to give a shout out to our transgender sisters because they are our sisters, right? Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. Last year marked the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Rebellion. It was not a riot, it was a rebellion against police brutality and police harassment against queer folks. So Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera had quite an active life politically. They were active in various organizations against police brutality, against the Vietnam War, against what was called back then urban renewal or urban removal, the nonprofit industrial complex. Back in the day, Sylvia Rivera warned people that a lot of organizations that are for civil rights or human rights or the rights of queer folks, etc., may be taken over and become more professional or become more polished or have more money and not care about grassroots folks. And sure enough, we have today the nonprofit industrial complex, the feminist industrial complex, the LGBTQ industrial complex. A lot of our movement organizations start out as very militant, radical, and grassroots. And over a period of time, they become more professional. They get money from corporate America, and they either don't care anymore about grassroots folks or they marginalize grassroots folks. And both Sylvia and Marsha warned us about that. And if you look around at many of our organizations today, they have strayed far, far, far from their radical grassroots beginning. Also interesting to note, both Marsha and Sylvia supported the Black Panther Party and the Young Lords. Sylvia Rivera herself was a Puerto Rican independentista. And they also, soon after Stonewall, founded the Gay Liberation Front, which gave a positive nod to the Algerian Liberation Front, the Vietnamese National Liberation Front, etc. So they carried on that militancy in their organizing well after Stonewall Rebellion. Okay, next one is Gwen Patton and Ethel Minor. Both of these sisters were in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Gwen Patton was the first female student body president of her campus, and she also was the direct action chair for the Tuskegee Institute Advancement League, which was a SNCC affiliate back in the mid-1960s. She also helped to found the National Black Anti-War Anti-Draft Union. So that was a major accomplishment in terms of organizing not only against the Vietnam War, but also organizing against the draft, against the selective service, and why young people should not be pretty much cannon fodder for US imperialist wars. Ethel Minor. I had the great pleasure of meeting Ethel Minor back in 2010 at the 50th anniversary of SNCC conference, which was held at Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina. I have a picture with her somewhere around here. But Ethel Minor is the one who, during her travels to South America, she met some Palestinian students. She talked with them. They exchanged ideas, and they shared with her information about Zionism, about the struggle of the Palestinian people. So when she returned to the US, she shared that information with her comrades of SNCC. Around the time of the '67 war, SNCC came out with a public declaration of being in solidarity with the Palestinian people and taking a position against Zionism in all of its theological and political manifestations. As you can well imagine, that didn't go over very well with a lot of people inside and outside of SNCC. But nonetheless, I happened to find a copy of the newsletter where part of this struggle was published, and SNCC lost a lot of money for that, but yes, they did. Yeah, the newsletter where that struggle was published, there was a lot of internal struggle inside of SNCC. There was a lot of heat that they caught, a lot of name calling that they caught from people outside of SNCC. A lot of the more white liberal members in SNCC left the organization due to their position against Zionism. Some stayed, but some left, and they got all kind of attacks. But if you look at all these years later, we can appreciate the work that they did to stand firm on this position, because now the Palestinian struggle is more widely known, it's more widely supported, all kind of resolutions, all kind of campaigns, BDS, etc. So we give a shout out to Ethel Minor and all the comrades of SNCC and what they taught us about Zionism. And Erica, you may have some more to share about Zionism if you want. I have some books here in my own library that I can share with folks at a later time, but it is a continuing struggle. And one thing I would just add, that for those of us who were in the movement, I came of age in the 1970s, 80s. Of course, Kwame Ture and others came of age in the 1960s. But a lot of what we learned about Zionism and about Palestinians, we not only learned from the Palestinians, but we also learned from our Jewish anti-Zionist comrades as well. Okay, so there are some books that I put on the last page of my slide where a lot of this information comes from. It is very good to see that for a lot of our people taking an anti-imperialist, taking an anti-capitalist, taking a socialist position on various issues, becoming more and more Pan-Africanist in our world outlook, in our travels, etc. It's gratifying to see so many of them embracing communist and socialist ideas. So some of the books there: Radicalism at the Crossroads, Sojourning for Freedom, Hammer and Hoe, To Turn the Whole World Over, and there's many, 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 many more. So I would hope that if any of you there have any articles or books that you would like to recommend, please send them to Erica to share with the rest of us. That would be very helpful. Let me just say one other quick thing. There's too many women, too many of our sisters that we could talk about, and there's not enough time, right? So we have to do this again. But I want to give a shout out to Fannie Lou Hamer, to Ella Baker, to all the women of the Black Panther Party, all the women of SNCC, women of the Caribbean, such as the Working People's Alliance of Guyana, the New Jewel Movement of Grenada, Johnny Tillman and others of the National Welfare Rights Organization. Quiet as it's kept, the National Welfare Rights Organization played a major role in pushing, if you will, Dr. King to speak out against the Vietnam War. It wasn't just the students of SNCC, it was also the National Welfare Rights Organization, Sister Johnny Tillman. And some people, you know, we think because someone is on welfare or they're very poor or whatever, that they cannot articulate political ideas or revolutionary ideas. But of course, once people are given a chance, they can do anything they set their minds to. So they played a role in the radicalization of that entire time period of the 1960s. So to everyone, thank you for listening. looking forward to our further discussion, any questions or comments you may have. So thank you all.
Thank you so much. And then also to your shout out to Fannie Lou and Ella Baker, Anasadua, I want to introduce next. We were just speaking about a quote that I found where she talks about having gone to Ghana and meeting with Toure and having sat down, and we were discussing that was really the beginning of SNCC's internationalism, that Africa reached out to them for their own, for their own struggle, to be a part of that struggle and to help them with that struggle. And she talks about that. So I do want to evoke her name, especially since yesterday was her birthday. And Ella Baker as well. That speech that went around post Biden mentioning her, people were like, "Oh, you don't know nothing about no Ella Baker," and then that speech where she really, as much as she talks about organizing, she is very sure to evoke and mention the importance of anti-capitalism, anti-imperialism. So we have to just remember that, we were part of these struggles, but there were specific politics in these struggles that Black women held. It wasn't that we were just on the front lines. We were on the front lines for specific politics because we understood where we fell as class, and as a part of a global structure. And if Africa isn't free, we are not free. And these women understood that as well. So that is where I'm going to introduce Anaselma, because Anye really, really, really makes it clear that if Africa is not free, honey, we are not free, period. So.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that intro. Thank you, Erica, for organizing this space. Thank you to my fellow panelists. Thank you to the ASL interpreters. I've never been on a Zoom with that before, and it's really impressive, so I appreciate y'all. And I also am very grateful for this conversation. So first of all, my name is Onyesanu Shatoye. I'm an organizer with the All African People's Revolutionary Party and the All African Women's Revolutionary Union, which is a revolutionary mass Pan-African socialist party founded in Africa, based in Africa, with chapters throughout the African world, with the political objective of Pan-Africanism, which we define as one unified socialist Africa. I'm also on the National Coordinating Committee of the Venceremos Brigade, which is a solidarity delegation to Cuba, fighting against the illegal US blockade on Cuba that we're gonna talk about later on. And also, I'm an editor for The Communist alongside my comrade Erica, and that's why I'm here. So, as I mentioned, I'm in the AAPRP. The AAPRP, once again, is a revolutionary mass Pan-African socialist party with the political objective of Pan-Africanism, which means one unified socialist Africa. For folks that don't know, the AAPRP was founded 53 years ago this year by Kwame Nkrumah. Kwame Nkrumah was, of course, the first democratically elected president of the first African nation to gain independence from Western imperialism. That nation was Ghana. When Ghana gained its independence at its first, Independence Day, Kwame Nkrumah gave a speech where he said, "The independence of Ghana is meaningless without the total liberation of the African continent." And what he meant by that is that even though Ghana had successfully waged a mass campaign to liberate themselves from British colonialism, even though they had elected this leader of their choice who had this massive anti-colonial vision, he also understood that being a small nation completely surrounded by territories that were under imperialist control meant that Ghana would not be strong enough to survive unless all of Africa was free and united in fighting imperialism together. So that is the baseline understanding that forms why the APRP exists, why our objective is Pan-Africanism. The other thing that's like a foundation to that belief, and the foundation to the belief that when Africa is free, Africans everywhere will be free, is an understanding that this entire global economic system of capitalism and imperialism is founded on the exploitation of Africa. It would not exist as a global system without the continuous exploitation of African land, African resources, and African people. Of course, everybody on this call knows about the transatlantic slave trade. It's the only reason I'm here. I would not choose to be here. If I was given the option, I'd rather be home in Honduras or in Africa. But the reason why I'm here is because my ancestors were kidnapped a long time ago and brought here to labor against our will, to form the foundation of US imperialism and US capitalism. But then once that happened, what we have to understand is that they didn't just leave Africa chilling. They weren't just like sweeping out the people, we're just gonna leave this resource-rich landmass alone. That's absolutely not what happened. All of these colonial powers, all of these imperialist powers, including the United States, scramble to get their hands on African resources and use these African resources to build up the wealth of what we know as the Western world or the global North. Like, the United States would not exist as a superpower without the exploitation of our labor, but also the theft of African land and resources. Europe would not exist as a political entity, as a superpower, without the exploitation of African land and African resources. I said the other day to my comrades, Big Ben, Buckingham Palace, the Eiffel Tower, the Queen's Crown, all of that stuff is ours, because all of those things were produced thanks to wealth stolen from Africa and labor exploited from African people. So with that understanding, that is why the APRP says that Africa must be unified and socialist and completely liberated from the forces of capitalism, from the forces of imperialism. But oftentimes, when we talk about that, right, when we say, when Africa is free, Africans everywhere will be free, we might get pushback from Africans in the United States, because it's not immediately clear to those of us living here what the connection is, what our connection is to Africa. And that was done intentionally. That was a systematic effort to strip our people, or to attempt, because it wasn't successful, but to attempt to strip our people of our connection to the land that we came from, to the history that we had before, and to the shared identity and destiny that we have together. There has been a systematic attempt to disconnect African people in the United States from the African continent in order to facilitate the US empire's continued exploitation of Africa. And also understanding that when we look at the tanks rolling through neighborhoods and brutally repressing protests, when we look at the massive criminalization of poor and working class African people in the United States, when we look at cases of African people being shot down in the street by militarized police, we see the same conditions existing not just throughout the United States, throughout the Western Hemisphere, and also in Africa. Also in Africa. The very same forces that gave these police tanks, that gave them military weapons through the 1033 program, the very same forces that are sending, police officers to Israel through with the Deadly Exchange program to learn new techniques to brutalize us, are also drastically expanding the US military's footprint in Africa through the project of AFRICOM. AFRICOM is the US military's Africa Command. If you've never heard about it, I would not be surprised, because they do not put that thing on the news whatsoever. But as we speak, there are 46 US military bases on the African continent. 53 out of 54 African nations have working agreements with the US military. There are hundreds of thousands of US troops on the ground in Africa. There are drone bases that are on a regular basis murdering people from the sky in places like Somalia, in places like Tanzania, in places like Kenya, increasingly, and throughout East Africa. So these very same forces, again, that gave the police the tanks that they used to brutally repress Black Lives Matter, that they used to brutally repress Standing Rock, that they used to brutally repress all these social justice movements in the United States, are also attacking Africa and stealing African land and stealing African resources. And so for that reason, I think it's essential that we have spaces like these where we can begin to have the conversation of why we must internationalize liberation struggles in the belly of the beast in the United States. African people were made US citizens against our will. African people have been catching hell from the US government from the very first moment we were brought here, and has not stopped even though we got paper rights. We have to understand that the very same reason that we are being oppressed and exploited and criminalized here is the very same reason that our people are suffering the exact same thing in Africa, in Honduras, in Haiti, and in every place we exist around the world. They are seeking to keep us on the bottom to maintain their stranglehold on our home. They are seeking to separate us from the African continent in order to continue to exploit that land and those resources to keep this global system running. We have to understand that our destiny is not tied to this empire that was built on stolen land with stolen people. Our destiny is tied to the most resource-rich and beautiful landmass on the face of the planet. Once we liberate Africa, once the resources and land of Africa are under our collective control as African people, we can use them to make sure that our people everywhere are good, that we have housing, that we have healthcare, that we have education for our children, that we have safety and security no matter where we exist. And then we can also make sure that this global genocidal system that only exists to consume and destroy and enslave and exploit can no longer use the wealth of our home to do those things. So I want to leave it at that. I just want to say, oh yeah, one last thing I want to add is that, like I mentioned, the very same people that are giving the police the tanks that they're using to attack Black Lives Matter, giving the police, you know, the bomb-seeking robots and the AR-15s, the very same people that did that also established AFRICOM. And when I say the very same people, I'm talking about George W. Bush. So AFRICOM was established as a program in the very last year of George W. Bush's second term as president, but then it was drastically expanded alongside the 1033 program under President Barack Obama. The first African US president of the United States is responsible not just for drastically expanding the US military footprint in Africa, but also responsible for arming police in the United States with millions of dollars worth of surplus military equipment they're now using to brutally repress social justice movements, including movements that probably a lot of people in this call are part of. So we're gonna talk about that more, I think, in the question and answer session, but it's really important to understand that like this effort to repress, exploit, criminalize, brutalize African people in the United States, in Africa, throughout the Western Hemisphere is a bipartisan effort. AFRICOM in 1033 started under a Republican president and they were expanded under a Democratic president. And regardless of who wins in November, whether it be Biden or Trump, they're going to continue these attacks upon African people and upon Africa itself.
Did I tell y'all she makes it clear? Thank you so much. All right, so I have my own questions. I came a little prepared for these panelists. So you each spoke to specific ways imperialism affects us, but I already touched a bit on it, a little bit, but why do you feel this message has been distorted in the mainstream? Like what has been the hindrance in a mass acceptance of these connections?
Well, I think there's always a lot of confusion purposely put out by the media, and even unfortunately sometimes put out by ourselves, either because we don't know any better or we do know better and we want to further that political confusion. And there's a lot more of that now. On the one hand, I understand it. On the other hand, it's distressing. And with this upcoming election, quite frankly, I'll be glad when that, you know what, stuff is over, because I've had some conversations with people who I know better, who I've been in political struggle with for many, many years. And soon as Kamala Harris pops up, you know, a Black woman pops up on the Democratic Party ticket, they lose their minds and they want to support a sister. But her record is very clear. And because we have this technology of the internet and articles on the internet, et cetera, it's very easy to do research. It's very easy to find that this woman joked about threatening jail to the parents of truant children in California. It's there. All these articles about all of these people, they're there. They're not hiding anywhere. They're not hiding under a rock or under a creek. They're there. But some people have made a conscious decision to ignore the truth because that's part of, you know, what they want to be about. You can do that if that's what you choose, but it's no need to have a long back and forth argument, and your arguments make no sense in the face of the truth and the facts about all these candidates, whether it be Joe Biden or Kamala Harris or whoever else. It's all very clear. So now, for the many years, and Asanyayu probably knows this, you know, we had campaigns against the Democratic Party going back to the 70s and 80s, right? And People made fun of us, said we were crazy, etc. Now, all these 30, 40 years later, people are not making fun of us anymore. They may disagree with us, but they're not making fun of us anymore because so many more people now see what we've been saying for all these years. You can research anyone's voting record in Congress or as a prosecutor or whatever. So there's no excuse to ignore that truth. And there's no excuse to make excuses for people who mean to do our people deliberate harm.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And I think to add on to that, I think, you know, as Onya said, that it's also intentional, right? Like there's been, you know, McCarthyism, like the Red Scare was like really, really damaging to Black communities and Black communist communities. And I mean, I remember the first time I read Hammer and Hoe and I was like, the fuck? You know, I was like, wow, no, you had working class, poor people in the woods, reading Marx in the wood, you know, hiding books in the tree and having different discussions around communism, you know, without any type of formal education, right? And like we mentioned, like there's a long history. There's very few Black women organizers in the 1920s, in the 1930s, or the 1940s who didn't also have a Pan-Africanist, communist, you know, politic. And so I think it's also a lack of history, right? If we don't, you know, and it's an intentional erasing of history. And so I think that's one thing. I think, you know, we don't talk, you know, as much around class and class contradictions. And I think the more we're able to talk about class within our movements and within Black communities, the more that we can like kind of resolve some of those contradictions and people can have more clear things that it's like representation's not enough. This like liberalization of, you know, of intersectionality or Black feminism is not enough. Like identity is not enough, but is rooted in a particular politic that says that Black women and other marginalized genders have a very particular condition that can demonstrate to us how imperialism works. You know, all the ways that we miss how capitalism works, we can look at the position of Black women to have a deeper understanding of that, which is where the legacy of Black feminism, Black left feminism. So I think that's intentional, but I do think, and I'm only 29, but I have these conversations with friends because I think for me also, I'm first generation Nigerian. And so I think, you know, something that's also illuminated is a lot of these people also were like first generation Jamaican, first generation Trinidadian. And so also had this world view of like, okay, Black people are oppressed in many different places. But I was saying that, yeah, as somebody who is like, grew up in the Catholic Church and moved through being agnostic, you know, a recognition that also people are returning back to African traditional religions. And that is like a site of resistance that historically is important for, you know, liberation movements. But there has been a manufactured disconnect between the continent and us. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I agree with everything that was just said by both speakers. And the only thing I'd add is that, like, I feel like people don't, like, so African people in the United States are a colonized population, right? And being a colonized population obviously comes with like a certain set of material conditions, but it also comes with like particular strategies from the colonial power to like misdirect you, to underdevelop you, to separate us from Africa, to confuse us about the nature of our oppression. So I feel like we don't understand the extent to which that messaging has been imposed upon us. I feel like even someone like Barack Obama, for example, or like Colin Powell or Condoleezza Rice, but Barack Obama is like the biggest example. His particular identity and him being allowed into that place was a strategy to target us, to like make us buy into the US empire, to make us believe that, you know, we have the, like any little African boy or girl, kid can grow to be president. We know it's not true. That's just not in the cards for me and like probably the majority of the people on this call. It's just not something that's gonna be possible. But now that this has happened, now this has been sold to us as like the dream, that's something that's possible. Now, like that's something that we believe in for ourselves. There was a very, very long time as African people in the United States where we understood ourselves to be in opposition to this place, not to be part of it. there was a very, very long time as African people, we understood our destiny to be independent of the destiny of the US empire. And I feel like with the advancement of these like neoliberal African figureheads, like Barack Obama, like that's been chipped away. Now it's more about like, when I hear African people talking about this election coming up, they're talking about we have to save the soul of the United States. And I'm like, why on earth would you want to do that? Like, when has it ever had a soul? It was started with indigenous genocide and slavery, and it continued growing through nothing but genocide and slavery. So why would I want to save the soul of a place that's never had a soul? But there's like an investment in the US empire that I think that was cultivated intentionally within us. Like something that's been done to a number of other colonized populations that assimilate into American identity is now happening to us with some success. And so I think that's like a big part of the reason why, you know, African left politics used to be explicitly anti-imperialist, and now I can get like pretty radical and people will not talk about imperialism at all in many spaces. And I feel like that's part of it. We've begun to identify with the empire.
Thank you. So that goes along to, that leads me into my next question. Because I've heard the question of, especially in this moment under the pandemic and such, where domestic issues are quite prominent. You know, people are without places to live, you know, things to eat. There's a large unemployment rate. And you would hear people, well, why should we care about imperialism in this moment, right? So we understand that imperialist economic sanctions are a tactic of war targeting particularly, you know, particular nations and strangling its economy. And the examples can be found in Cuba, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, etc. But can any of you speak to what sanctions would look like for colonized communities in the West, just so we can make a connection to why we should actually care? Because sanctions are not just happening out there, sanctions are happening here. So if you can give any examples of what that might look like.
I can. So I think you were the first one to make this connection for me, but welfare reform under the Clinton administration in the 90s that like cut off access to food for thousands of African families, particularly families that had single parent, single mother households. Like that was a deliberate strategy of counter-revolution on the part of the Clinton administration. That wasn't just him being like, let's save some money by starving a bunch of people. That was a deliberate strategy to target African people as a colonized population in the United States. And because like, look at who it impacted: single parent households, single mothers, children, families. When we look at the impact of that kind of economic targeting within the United States, it's extremely similar to the impact of sanctions outside the United States. Because sanctions as a strategy, no matter where they're deployed, are meant to target the most vulnerable segments of a given population. That means women, that means queer and trans people, that means sex workers, that means children, that means elders, that means disabled people. Like that is who sanctions are meant to hurt. When Bill Clinton cut the welfare funding and it affected all those families, they knew precisely who was going to be impacted, and that was the intent. When the same administration actually who was that lady's name? Madeleine Albright, when she was Secretary of State. Well, when the Clinton administration decided that they had had enough of Saddam Hussein and they like sanctioned Iraq and killed 100,000 kids, same impact. And they even like openly admitted it. Madeleine Albright went on 60 Minutes and they were like 100,000 children died in Iraq. And she was like, it was worth it. Even though it didn't even depose him, it took like another war. But this is what we have to understand about how the US empire operates, like how these like strategies of imperialism work. They are intentionally designed to target the most vulnerable populations. Because when you target families, when you target women, when you target disabled people, when you target elders, you're targeting like the foundation of a community. You're like attacking it at the base to bring the whole thing down as an intentional strategy of collective suffering to get imperialism's way in a particular space. So I absolutely think that we should look at things like welfare reform, that we should look at, you know, funding cuts in underdeveloped communities where African and indigenous people live in the United States as precisely the same strategy that's being deployed in places like Cuba, places like Venezuela, in places like Zimbabwe, in places like Iran during a pandemic. It's precisely the same strategy meant to target the very same group of people.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I'm glad you brought up like sex workers. I think another example is like there was a couple federal bills like Sesta Fosta, and I'm forgetting the other bill, which basically restricts, and it's also an ongoing thing, right? Like specifically Black trans people, particularly Black trans women and sex workers, are restricted from accessing PayPal, Cash App, or other mediums that require a certain level of government verification in order to access funds or transfer funds from one person to another. Also, the closing of like websites that people use to exchange sex services. Again, it's a direct target of like poor Black people, oftentimes people who are disabled, oftentimes people who can't find jobs in the formal economies. I think higher prices for food in colonized communities is like one form. Also, having segregated communities, meaning you have to leave your community depending on race and class in order to access healthcare, education, all these other basic things. And then specifically, like in DC, it took over 3 months for the DC government to increase testing, COVID-19 testing sites in Ward 7 and 8, which are predominantly Black communities, right? And now you have all these drive-through testing sites at CVS and all these places in certain parts of DC, but there's also large swaths of the country that still don't have access to testing. And so this is like intentionally trying to cut off access to basic needs for specific groups of people, I think are forms of also economic sanctions domestically.
This is Afro Felix, and I have a question to ask.
Can I'm gonna do the Q&As when I finish the panel questions. But if you want to put the question in the chat, then I can ask.
Okay, I will decline them.
All right. So you guys, each one of you have touched up on this. You touched up on this a bit. Well, actually, more than enough, truly. But I do want to talk a little bit more in depth about the context of this discussion on Black women and internationalism and the election itself. Because I really can't get across enough that the vote blue, no matter who, sort of fear mongering is sort of funneling us into a no way out situation. And I think that the, the, the way that Trump is used is sort of egging that on. And it's making it easier for us to walk ourselves right into a corner where we will not be able to get out, essentially, because we're just looking at the immediate get him out without looking at the politics of the people that are in opposition, allegedly, to him. So if any of you want to touch up on what do you feel the importance of Black women and internationalism fits in the election 2020?
If I may, I think in some previous conversations, when we look at U.S. domestic policy, it's always a reflection of U.S. foreign policy. So a harmful policy here has some type of counterpart in U.S. foreign policy. If you look at what you mentioned about sanctions against Venezuela, the attempt to overthrow the legitimate government of Bolivia, etc. If you look at all the protests that happened since the police murder of George Floyd, most of them young people, many of them protesting for the very first time in their lives. It's not just protesting against the police murder of George Floyd, as horrendous as that was and caught on camera. People are seeing how US policies are killing people in other countries, and they're seeing that on camera, on video as well. They're seeing the police brutality here. They're seeing that young people can't get a job. If you do go to college and get a degree, you're going to be in student debt for the rest of your life, right? I think these protests, as angry and as militant as they were, and even at my age, I don't remember seeing a police building being set on fire. I think this shows that for a lot of people, this system is having less and less legitimacy because of how the material conditions of people here in this country are getting worse, but they see how the US has a negative, dangerous, and deliberate effect on the material conditions of people in other countries, including Africa. People are seeing that, and I think they're responding accordingly, even though they may not articulate it that way.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I think I talked to a lot of elders, and they've all said like they haven't seen something how they've seen this, like the level of resistance globally as they've seen these last few months, right? Where like the more we're able, which I think the role of a revolutionary is to expose, one of the roles is to expose the contradictions, right? As Asawante was saying, is that the more we expose it here, the more it empowers people globally to fight against US imperialism and US capitalism. So I think, it's interesting because Fannie Lou Hamer's birthday was yesterday, and I see a lot of folks trying to fit her again into these liberal conceptions of freedom. And like Fannie Lou Hamer, along with SNCC, they built an independent political party about 100, less than 100 years after the Civil War, right? So also just like contextualizing what the particular strategy and tactics were at the particular time, and that had not necessarily been tried, even though people had ran for political office, particularly Black men had ran for political office in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Like what she did was unheard of, and it was to contend with the Democratic Party. And yeah, like Black people have used different tactics in order to like build political party, and I watched a video by Charlene Mitchell, who was the first Black woman to run for president of the United States. People say Shirley Chisholm a lot, but Charlene Mitchell was actually the first Black woman, and she ran under the Communist Party. And there's an interview where she says her measure of success was not whether she would be president or win the election, but rather would the American people be open to the ideas of communism, right? With them, like using a tactic, engaging in this electoral fight, not to re-entrench Black people into the Democratic Party, not to drive people, mass, people who are being radicalized in this moment to the Democratic Party, which is directly antagonistic to the interest of Black people. It was, will Americans be open to communism? And we need more people in a public sphere talking about communism and exposing people to those types of ideas and organizing people towards those ideas. We don't need more people trying to use radical language and radical strategies to re-entrench Black people into the Democratic Party. Like, I just think that is just like, so, like, I really hate it. I really hate it because I just feel it's like you really leading Black people. You're just really lying to Black people. You're really, Black people understand what their situation is. Black people understand what their conditions are, which is why state repression is so high, because the people who are being most impacted, when people tell them about, oh, this is why you're being impacted in these ways, it makes sense. When people say, oh, we got to create things outside of the state, it makes sense because Black people are already doing that at the margins. And so for you to then say, where most Black people still don't have access to voting, and most working class or most Black people that I talk to on a day-to-day basis, even folks that I went to like law school and college with, are not voting. So even if that class of people is not voting or not paying attention to politics in that way, it's really frightening for people to organize folks into that. And so, yeah, I say that to say that historically Black people, Black people have built independent political power in order to contend for power. And I think that we need to use this election to further expose the contradictions of the state and making sure that people know, like, this is happening every 4 years. right? The fact that they put Kamala Harris with Biden is a complete, as Onye Song said, like Obama was an intentional strategy, a counter-revolutionary strategy, in the same ways that like Biden and Kamala Harris, that is a complete slap in the Black Lives Matter abolitionist movement. That we have a top cop, Kamala Harris, who was the prosecutor and state attorney of the largest state in the country, putting Black people in jail, and have that as a representation of like what we should be organizing for. And so and I think somebody asked about local elections. I think, again, it's like most people are not running on a non-democratic ticket. And so I don't really understand, other than like, folks are saying that it's a better organizing strategy, or it's better money, or you get more resources on running under the Democratic Party. I don't understand why people can't create other parties and actually have a radical platform, and move people through that, and also make sure that it's not, at the end of the day, it shouldn't matter who's in office, regardless of if we're in a socialist country or communist country, because we would have built the mass revolution and a mass base of people to dictate what somebody can do in office. So it's never about an individual. And I think that's where the starting point can come from. If you do have a large swath of educated, politically conscious people, then it doesn't matter who's in office. So that's my thing.
I love that last part so much. Was someone going to speak?
Yeah.
Well, can we get some questions from the audience?
Yeah, I was going to,
yeah, I just want to say something very quickly.
I want to do the Q&A from the audience because I have about 4.
So go or no?
Go ahead, yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so just very quickly about the 2020 election, I feel like it was a very serious strategic error to allow Trump to be made into like individual big bad. And it's been like repeated continuously across like multiple spaces, even like so-called left spaces. People are like, okay, yes, Biden's terrible, but we must unite to out Trump. And they're calling Trump a fascist and all kinds of things that are like purely emotional responses to someone who would not be possible as like a political figure without a foundation laid by people like Barack Obama, by like George Bush, by both Bushes, by the Clintons. Like Trump has not done anything that he has not been allowed to do by the fundamental nature of the US government. If Trump is a fascist, then Joe Biden is a fascist. If Trump is a fascist, then Barack Obama is a fascist. I'm willing to accept that, but I feel like people focus on this individual to avoid having to deal with the fundamental nature of the United States. Like we said repeatedly, this was an empire that was founded by committing genocide against indigenous nations, stealing their land, enslaving my ancestors, and then looting this entire hemisphere, Africa, and most of Asia and the Middle East for hundreds of years. So understanding that, anyone who comes to power within this empire, anyone who occupies the position of the presidency is going to have to be complicit with genocide, is going to have to be complicit with theft, is going to have to be willing to brutally repress internal domestically colonized populations, as well as colonized populations in Africa and around the world. And by focusing on Trump as somehow an aberration from this like very, very long legacy of violence that undergirds the United States, it is allowing people to ignore the fundamental contradiction. You're making Trump the problem and you're not looking at what made Trump possible. Trump is like a pure creation of the US empire. There's never been, in my lifetime, a more perfect person to be president of the United States than Donald Trump, because Donald Trump is like the perfect embodiment of what the US empire is and always been. It was the same thing under Barack Obama. It was the same place under Bill Clinton. It would have been the same place under Hillary Clinton. It's the same place under Joe Biden. People are lying to themselves when it comes to the differences between Trump and Biden and the fundamental nature of this place. And this 2020 election, regardless of who wins, until we understand that that's like the fundamental issue, this place is the issue, the politics of this place and how it moves in the world is the issue, we're gonna guarantee that someone worse than Trump will pop up.
Thank you so much. So we have audience Q&As that I do want to get to because there's some really good ones. Someone asks, can you give an envisioning on how we can unite our African liberation forces in 2020 during this uprising and pandemic? So I guess to paraphrase that, it's like, what can we do to unify you know, the diaspora in this moment, and then, you know, organizations as well.
Zoom meetings.
Yeah, we got the benefit of all this modern technology. But I also feel like we have to internationalize struggles against police terrorism in the United States, like point blank period. Like we have to make the connections between what is being done to our people here, what's being done to our people in Africa, what's being done in Haiti, what's being done in Honduras, because it's the same thing. It's the same conditions, the same violence coming from the same people for the same reasons. We must begin to make these connections and then use this modern, wonderful technology to like build one-to-one relationships with other struggles. Like that is the motto of how the APIP organizes, the motto of how Black Alliance for Peace organizes. Like we're out here doing this work, but we need everybody in the streets, every action, every organization to be making these internationalist connections.
All right, I'll get to the next question. So now that Black families are being evicted and attacked by the state during COVID-19 America, what are the practical ways you all are doing to prepare for the waves of oppression happening in Black and poor and working class communities across the nation and world over? So are you involved in any local, international struggles against Black repression? And yeah.
I mean, I think folks should start within like what they feel like they can do. I think we always want something like really big and really grand, and that kind of organizes us out of doing anything. And I think folks should do something. So even if it's just like, you know, I just moved to a new place, and something that I'm trying to do starting at the end of October, beginning of November is like jerk Friday dinners, and set up a table outside of my apartment and give folks hot meals like twice a month with some type of hygiene pack and some type of like zine or like one page around what's happening, and trying to connect these fights and like have some like, you know, cool language and art explaining like, you know, the conditions of right now. Something else that I've been working on for the last few months is fundraising for a group of Black trans folks in Nigeria. And so they were able to get a safe house in Lagos, and they're working on getting another safe house for trans folks in Southeast Nigeria. And now I'm trying to figure out, okay, how do I build like more political relationships with folks, you know, that are coupled with like the type of work that I'm doing. And then I think conversations like this, like I think a lot of folks are doing a lot of book clubs, and like just creating a Zoom, like how can, you know, there's a lot of folks on the internet in different countries. And so trying to have more cross-country, international conversations. But I think starting from where you at and what you feel like you can do, and that can be simple as like making sure your neighbors and the people in your immediate circle are good.
So we have another question. What does liberation of Africa look like without haphazardly evoking colonization or neo-imperialism? And they cited Liberia as an example.
It's gotta be socialist. So like there's like a lot of African folks from the United States, not a lot, because you know, travel is a privilege, but there's sometimes I come across African people who want to go to Africa and like open up businesses, because like it's like a wide open economy. And I'm just like, how is that gonna help Africa if all you're doing is like looking to get like a cut of, you know, what capitalism is doing to the world in another context? Then that's not going to liberate the continent. What we need in order to liberate Africa is a mass revolutionary African people's movement that is led by poor and working class African people, that has a socialist political orientation, that has a one unified objective of one unified socialist Africa, rather than seeking to export, you know, American small business values to Africa and say, if I have Black-owned businesses in Ghana, that this is somehow contributing to liberation of our people. We have to understand that our exploitation as African people and exploitation of Africa is intrinsically tied to capitalism as an economic system, which means that we must overthrow and replace capitalism in order to realize the liberation of Africa. If that is the foundation of the work that we're doing, if that you know, bottoms up ideology is like the foundation of how we build relationships, then it's not going to be another Liberia. Liberia was an intentional colonial project initiated by the US government seeking to start businesses on behalf of US corporations in Liberia led by African people from the United States. That is very, very different than what the APIP is seeking to do by uniting struggling African people's formations all around the continent and all around the world from the bottom up to build a socialist, unified Africa.
And then there was a call-in question earlier, Afro Phoenix. So I wanted to give them a chance if they still wanted to ask their question because they are calling in, so they won't be able to type it in the chat. So if they want to ask their question now, I'm going to open the floor to them. They want to give them that space before we close out.
Yeah. Okay, I'm here, Afro Phoenix. Yes, I was wondering how, well, first of all, I understood how you all explained it, so it could bring down lofty ideas and thoughts down to elementary level so that we could really understand it. And I recall one of the ones was that during the Clinton era, where they did take away the public health that was available because it directly impacted me and my family, and so I was able to make that connection there. And I'm also learning too about all these other ideas that I was not aware of, just totally oblivious. And so I just wanted to say that I appreciate you all making it so that it's understandable to the ones who are not as versed in these revolutionary thoughts.
Thank you so much. I respect everyone's time, and it is 10:01, and I did intend for this to be just 2 hours, and I have a child who is in virtual school, so we got to be up in the morning. So, but I appreciate everyone for joining us this evening. There were so many questions that were really good about, about not imperialism, but about communism and anarchism and, the bourgeoisie class and class dynamics. And I think that is worth another panel, organizing another one so we can break down those terms and where we fit, because I do think that understanding a lot of this does entail understanding your class dynamics and understanding what class is, because there's a big rejection from colonized communities, specifically African people, of identifying as poor working class people, despite being poor working class people. Which is why we champion celebrity so much, because the idea is that that is the American dream, that we can succumb to it and we can reach that dream if we just pull up our bootstraps, whatever nonsense. But so I do think that is worth talking about, but for the sake of time, I'm gonna wrap this up. But I appreciate the panel. I think we did lose Anasatua, but I appreciate the panel, and I'm so grateful for the interpreters that were able to join us this evening. I appreciate everyone for coming in. I don't think I did a real introduction of myself if I did not mention that I am organizing member of the Black Alliance for Peace, which is an anti-war coalition. So that is why I am very, very, very much invested in making sure folks understand imperialism so that we can end the war on African people here and abroad. I am a member of the Ujima People's Progress Party, which is a political party, a Black political party, a workers-led Black political party, just under the same guise as Fannie Lou Hamer. We can create our own independent political parties here in Maryland. That's what we are doing. So if you want to learn more about that, we are on Facebook, we are on Twitter, we are on Instagram. I am co-editor of Hood Communist as well, and I also run my own book gifting initiative for Black children called Liberation Through Reading, and a book club under that same title. So once again, thank you guys for joining me this evening. Thank you, Nana, so much. Thank you, Onye, so much. And have a good night. Forward ever, backward never.
Good night.
Night.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.